Dave, I remember in the mid-1990s, I was really excited to read your material talking about your conversion, if you will, to dualism. It's sort of a view that I had, but felt very guilty about it because I was trained in brain science. But you made it acceptable for people who were scientists maybe to entertain dualism in some fashion. Do you still believe the way you did?
I do, yeah. Reluctantly, especially originally it was quite reluctantly, because I come from a scientific background. I was trained in mathematics and physics, and I want everything to be natural, reduced to the simplest possible set of laws and entities. And the materialistic view of the world is a beautiful, aesthetically appealing view of the world that promises to explain everything. Physics to chemistry to biology to sociology. But there's this problem with consciousness. It just leaves a gap. Every physical theory ever devised leaves a gap to consciousness. So I banged my head against the wall for years, trying to come up with a physically based theory of consciousness. Every week I had a different physical theory of consciousness. None of them worked. And eventually I came to see this is for systematic reasons. There are reasons why no purely physical theory will ever give you consciousness. It'll always be an objective theory of objective functions. None of that ever gives you subjective experience. So then it just seemed to me that on conservative scientific grounds, you don't postulate entities without necessity, but when you need to, when the existing theory doesn't explain all the phenomena, you've got to expand the theory. And therefore I said, okay, we've got to add new fundamental properties to our view of the world, not just space, time, mass, charge, but consciousness.
I have to ask you, did this conversion take place over a long period of time, several years, or was it like a sudden realization over a short period?
There wasn't a eureka moment, there was this gradual dawning. It's like, oh my God, I think I have to accept dualism. Materialism isn't going to do the work. And this was reluctant because I thought that materialism was the respectable, scientifically motivated view. So only over time did I come to see that no, you could be a dualist and it could still be completely compatible with science. You could still be naturalistic, you could have laws governing simple entities, and you could do science with it. You could have a science of consciousness. This needn't lead you to ghosts, to spirits, to demons, or even to God. So I think it was coming to see that reconciled me with this dualism.
So with your dualism, what did your scientific friends say when you first came out of the closet?
Oh, I remember my dad said to me, don't tell me you're going to spend your life looking for the soul. It's like, boy, many promising young minds have dribbled away their intellect on that.
So seriously, did some of your scientific colleagues express concern about your waywardness?
I don't know. I think, hopefully I'd earned a little bit of credit by that point as, having a reasonable scientific mind and appreciation for the scientific worldview. So it wasn't like it was just, laughed off. But on the other hand, there was the odd eyebrow raised. Boy, we have a dualist in our midst. I would like to think that over time, some of them have at least come to, not everyone's been converted, but I think maybe people have come to see that this is in fact a respectable option. You needn't be going off into cloud cuckoo land by believing that our inventory of the world's fundamental properties has to be expanded to include consciousness.
Now, there's a large other group of philosophers, people who believe in theism, theologians, who have taken your work and have used it to reinforce their view of an immortal soul or some sort of substance, dualist, immaterial substance that has a religious connection. How do you view those efforts to appropriate your work into their worldview?
Well, I would really love it if there's an immortal soul, because I want to live forever. And that's probably going to be the best way to do it, by having an immortal soul. But as a scientist, I have to step back and say, what's the evidence? What's the reason to believe in this? And so far, I don't see any scientific evidence that forces one to believe in a soul. Yes, there's consciousness, but that's just another natural property of us as organisms in a natural world. One way there could be consciousness is for it to be attached to these indestructible things, souls that persist forever and exist after life and so on. I just don't see the evidence to believe in that. To believe in those things would be to take a massive inference from any evidence that we currently have. So as a scientist, I just can't yet go there. It's a hypothesis, but I just don't see why one should believe it's true.
Clearly, you can't exclude it.
No, of course you can't. As a scientist, you've got to allow all kinds of possibilities. But what do you believe? What do you accept? You accept what the evidence compels you to accept. I don't think the evidence compels one to believe in souls.
One can say that if you go to the step of admitting that there is consciousness, something that is independent of the physical world as we know it today, that the concept of an immortal soul follows naturally, or some kind of soul, immortal or not, because a non-physical substance dualistic thing, because science itself, by virtue of the definition you just made, is incapable of evaluating this whole realm. It's incapable. It cannot apply the same methodology of experiment and testing because, by definition, this dualistic substance is immaterial.
I think you can perfectly well do science with consciousness. Consciousness, after all, we can observe it more directly than we can observe anything else, at least in my own case. I can examine the contents of my consciousness. I could, write it down. I can parameterize it. I can study my brain at the same time. I can connect the properties of my consciousness, the properties of my brain. This is what's happening right now, actually, in some of the more interesting corners of neuroscience and psychology. People are going into labs. They're measuring properties of people's consciousness, perhaps by asking them, perhaps by studying their own state. They're correlating this with states of the brain, and they're coming up with principles, laws that say, when your brain is like this, your consciousness is like this. They study the way that consciousness develops over time. It starts simple. It gets more complex. Nothing there so far seems to be leading anyone to believe in souls. It looks like, consciousness starts simple, it grows, it fades out. If it was a soul, I don't know what kind of picture we'd expect, but...
Is your consciousness, let me try this word, immaterial?
It's not physical. Yeah. There are properties of the world that go beyond atoms in space and time with mass and charge. We need to add a further property to our inventory of the world's properties. Consciousness. That doesn't mean it needs to be located in some wholly different realm up in heaven or in the land of ectoplasm and so on. It may be attached to the same stuff right down here. It could be that even fundamental particles have consciousness as among the fundamental properties along with mass and charge. That's not to say they have souls.
But are you saying that science must be able to evaluate this stuff, or is it possible that, according to your definition, where it is not of the current physical thing and it is immaterial, that science is unable to make a judgment ultimately of what they can talk about correlations or whatever, but it cannot ultimately judge that? Is that a possibility?
I think it's always an open question with any phenomenon that science won't be able to explain it. But as scientists, we should take the attitude of trying to devise the best scientific theory of it we can. And in the case of consciousness, there are puzzles. There are unique mysteries. But it seems to me that here is how we can actually make it a tractable scientific problem. Admit consciousness as a fundamental property. Try to study the way it correlates with everything else in the world, with brains, with behavior. Find the principles that connect it to physics, and so on, and then say, okay, here is the way the world works. Here are the physical laws. Here are laws connecting physical processes with consciousness. That's a natural scientific theory. That explains the phenomena. Now, maybe somewhere along the way, we'll butt our heads up against a wall, and it's going to turn out that we can't make any more progress. And then, maybe we're going to have to start from scratch. But so far, I think so good.
So, no souls, no immortal souls, at least not yet.
No reason to believe in them yet. If I've got one, fantastic. But someone's going to have to convince me.